Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining me. This is Kathy and I'm back with another penguin card today using the penguin poop stamp set from Whimsy Stamps. I'll also be using the stitched dome stacked Die-namics from My Favorite Things and a brick stencil. And I end up using another stencil and another set of dies later on down the road, but I'll talk about those when I get there. I started out by stamping this little penguin with the ice cream onto a piece of Cougar Super Smooth cardstock, and I used My Favorite Things Extreme Black Hybrid ink. Once I had that little guy stamped, I just colored him up, and I colored him the exact same way as I did all of the other penguins. So this card ended up going in a completely different direction than I had intended it to. This was going to be a clean and simple card, and it ended up turning into a bunch of different techniques and using different products. So I tried to put the video in a logical order, so hopefully it's not too jumpy. For the ice cream cone itself, I used two colors. I used a YR27 and a Y23. I realize now I could have just used one color. For the ice cream, I used R83 and R81. I started with R83, and around the swirly parts, I made sure to leave some pretty good white space. And then I filled that in with R81. And then I go and shade in the belly of the penguin with B60. I'll make sure to have all of the supplies that I used listed in the description below. I'll also list the individual Copic colors that I used as well. After I was done shading the belly of the penguin, I did go over the B60 with my Colorless blender just to soften the edges a little bit. Then I decided to add a little bit more shading to the ice cream part, so I went back in with the R83 and the R81. I set that aside and started to work on my little igloo. For the igloo, I just grabbed a scrap of cardstock and taped it to the back of the brick stencil. I used my tumbled glass distress oxide ink and applied that directly to my craft mat. I grabbed my palette knife and mixed some Martha Stewart glitter paste in sugar cube with the tumbled glass distress oxide ink, and then I just spread it around the stencil so I could have that brick pattern. One thing I noticed about this glitter paste is that it spread pretty easily. I kind of went back and forth to make sure that I had really good coverage, and adding the tumbled glass distress oxide ink just gave it a tiny little bit of color to it. And I wasn't too worried about the color being even on the bricks. I just wanted there to be just a little bit of a tint. Next, I took a piece of Bristol Smooth cardstock and I cut it down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and this is to work on my sky background. I started out with Distress Oxide ink in peacock feathers and used an ink blending brush to blend some of that on. Then I used Cracked Pistachio Distressed Oxide ink and blended those two colors together. I left white space at the bottom because I was going to cover that up anyway. And here I come in with the polka dot stencil from Whimsy Stamps. I thought that if I was going to have an igloo, I probably should have a snowy sky. So for the stencil, I used Ranger texture paste, and I like this texture paste because it dries white. I set those two panels aside to dry, and I let them dry overnight. I did find that the glitter paste, the one that I used for the igloo, was still kind of tacky. So to get rid of that tack, I just used my embossing buddy bag and pounced it over the top of it, and that got rid of that weird tackiness. Next, I grabbed the stitched dome dies from My Favorite Things and I taped a larger one to the bottom of the piece, and then I took the smallest and the second smallest to create like a frame. I grabbed a piece of Nina Solar White cardstock and used my wavy border dies from Pink and Maine to create a snowbank, because kind of dawned on me that if I'm going to have an igloo and a snowy sky, that I should probably have a snowbank to go with it. I ran those through my die cut machine. For the Igloo, I wanted to have like a little door opening, and I didn't want to have the bricks show through, so then I took the smallest dome die and adhered that to the very bottom of the large dies and ran that through my die cut machine so that I would have a little door. Next, I took some foam tape so that I could adhere the opening of the Igloo to the front of the Igloo, and I wanted to have it popped up just to have a little bit of a dimension. I Googled pictures of igloos to see what they look like, and that front part always seemed to stick out, so that's why I decided to put foam tape on the back of that. And I didn't put foam tape on the very bottom yet, because I knew that I was going to have to do a double layer of foam tape on that because I was going to pop up the Igloo itself. I also cut off that tiny little strip at the bottom because it wasn't necessary at all. So I placed my opening for the Igloo on the front there. Next, I grabbed the inked and stenciled panel and adhered my snowdrift. And I wanted to cut that down just a little bit, so I grabbed a stitched rectangle die and kind of put that in place and used the Igloo as a guide so I would know where to tape down that rectangle die so I wouldn't cut too much off that one side. After I ran that through my die cut machine, I adhered that to the front of a top folding A2 size note card, and the card base that I used is also Neenah 80-pound solo white cardstock. Next, it was time to put my little Igloo in place, so I put some foam tape on the back side of that, and there is where I put the double layer of foam tape. Because I had that front little opening piece already popped up on foam tape, I wanted to make sure that the rest of it stayed flush. The other thing that I did was I added a little bit of glue to the back of the foam tape because I was putting it on top of the texture paste. I want to make sure that it was going to stick down really well. Then I decided that it looked kind of odd that the inside of the Igloo was bright white like the snowdrift, so to change the color just a little bit, I used BG10 and just filled in that opening. I think that makes it kind of pushes the interior of the Igloo back a little bit. I wasn't too worried about it being all shaded and all perfect. I just wanted it to be a different color than white. After I had that colored in, I added my little penguin, and I just used my AdTech tape runner to adhere him down, but I also added a tiny little bit of liquid glue like at the very top of the ice cream, and also on his on the other wing, just to make sure that it would stick down flat. After I adhered the penguin, I decided to add just a little bit of shading underneath him so it didn't look like he was just kind of floating on the snow. I started with C5 and blended that out with C1, and then blended that out with C0. And it was at this point where I went to do the other side of the Igloo and underneath the front of it that I really didn't mean to use C5. I meant to use C3, C1, and C00. So I just kind of switched up the colors on that other side, and then I just kept blending out the C5 underneath the penguin just to make it a little bit lighter. Once I was done with that, I thought I was done with the card, and then I decided that my little Igloo needed a sign. In the stamp set, there is a sentiment that reads, "Scoop, there it is." So I masked the bottom part of that sentiment off with some painter's tape and inked it up with VersaFine Onyx Black ink, and stamped that onto just a tiny little scrap of white cardstock that I had. Next, I took the other sentiment that reads "Ice cream solves everything" and masked off the "solves everything" so I would only end up with the words "ice cream" stamped. Important note, make sure you remove your mask before stamping it down. Then I sat and I looked at it and I thought, what can I do to make that stand out a little more? So I grabbed another die set. This one is from Pink and Maine, and I think it's called Cloudy Window Frames. And the smallest one worked out perfectly to create a sign to go around my "Scoop ice cream" words. To bring in just a little bit more pink, I just colored that frame with R83, and I did go around the outer edges with the marker as well as the inside edges so that they weren't white. I added a little bit of Tombow Mono Multi-Liquid Glue on the back and tapped off the excess on a scratch paper, and then just put that in place over my stamped words. I used my scissors to cut it out, and I kind of tried to go around the wavy edges as best I could. There were a few spots that I couldn't get into because some of those little scallopy bumps are pretty small. So I just put that back on my scratch paper after I cut it out and just added another coat of the R83 marker. And you can't really even see the little white pieces that I wasn't able to cut off. And to finally finish it up, I put my sign in place, and to adhere that down, I used liquid glue again because it's going on top of that glitter paste. I want to make sure that it was going to stick really well. And that finishes up my card for today. Thank you so much for joining me. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, I'd love it if you would. And don't forget to ring the bell so you're notified every time a new video is posted. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.